If you are watching this online and I've not met you before, my name is Matt. I'm the vicar from Kirkleatham Parish, and it's made up of St Cuthbert's and of St Hilda's in Redcar. If you have heard the Bible being read in church or at home over many years, you will probably have noticed the recurring theme of planting and sowing. In a time when there were no supermarkets back in Bible times and survival depended on a good harvest, it's no wonder that we hear again and again this recurring theme of planting and sowing. Well, this struggle for things to grow has also been a recurring theme in our garden. This is the third year in a row that Sarah has attempted to grow pumpkins. The first year, she was given the impression that pumpkins were easy to grow. No pumpkins. The second year, a few lessons were learnt from the previous year, but there was an understanding that it wasn't quite as easy as some tried to make out. No pumpkins. This year, we have just seen the start of the first growing pumpkin in 3 years. Now, of course, it's too early to say whether it will survive, but the fact that there is any pumpkin at all, even though it's just very, very small, has caused much rejoicing. This parable of Jesus, the parable of the sower, that's our gospel reading this morning, is one of the most well-known of Jesus' parables. And it's also the reason why we hear about this theme of sowing in the reading from Isaiah. It's a recognition that growing fruit and vegetables is not as easy as Monty Don likes to make out. Much like our pumpkins, we can easily think that the conditions for growth look good. However, we soon realise that something was not quite right, and growth either doesn't happen or doesn't last, or even worse, the only things that do grow are the weeds, as our lawn will testify to. According to Jesus, then, if we want growth, what is the answer? What is the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach his listeners? Well, helpfully, this is one of the few parables that Jesus goes on to explain the meaning of. What we learn is that we know what good growth looks like, not just by how healthy the plant is, but by the fact that it bears fruit. And Jesus says it would yield 160 or 30-fold. In other words, the pumpkins grew. Jesus says anyone who hears the words of the kingdom, the result of that message, that really takes hold of someone's life, is fruit. The kingdom message of God's reigning rule on earth is seen when God is working in and through us. That is what we see in Paul's letter to the Romans. When God's Spirit is in people, there is a noticeable change in them. Where there is God's Spirit, his presence, there is life, and therefore there is fruit. Paul tells his readers in verse 11, if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies, also through his Spirit that dwells in you. It is an incredible thought that the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead lives inside of us. Therefore, if we want to see God change us and bring about his kingdom blessing to the world, we are encouraged to ask again to be filled with his Spirit. And my prayer is that we all may bear fruit as the presence of God works in and through us. This week I heard an amazing story of these ideas lived out in the life of one man. It was one of those stories that fitted so well with today's theme, I have to share it with you. On the 9th of July 1737, 26-year-old Moravian missionary George Schmidt arrived on the shores of Cape Town, South Africa. George moved to Baviaanskloof, or the Valley of Baboons, and set up the first Protestant mission station in South Africa. He built himself a home, and he planted a pear tree in his new garden. George befriended and educated a small group of displaced Khoi people and taught them to farm so that they wouldn't go hungry. After 5 years of educating the community and sharing faith, George baptized the first new followers of Jesus. News of the baptism, understandably, upset some in the state church, and the scrutiny that Schmidt came under, the opposition to his mission that followed, led to his departure from South Africa in 1744, just 6 years after his arrival. And so it does make us wonder what it must have been like for George Schmidt to leave. I'm sure that he must have felt that he had failed. That's not what he planned. That's not what he intended to happen. After all, what would become of those few coy Christians that he left behind? Well, 50 years later, after Schmidt had died, a new generation of Moravian missionaries returned to South Africa to find out. In his book, Lord of the Ring, Phil Anderson writes, on arriving back at Baviaanskloof in 1792, the three missionaries soon located the ruin of Schmidt's original house. In the tiny garden, to their amazement, stood a giant pear tree, the results of the tiny shoot that Schmidt had planted. Even greater surprises were in store. Soon they made acquaintance of an old woman named Magdalena. On finding out who they were, she introduced herself as one of the original believers who had been baptized 50 years previously. The light of faith still burnt in her heart, and for half a century, this remarkable woman had nurtured and led the indigenous church which Schmidt had founded. She drew out a small leather bag and asked if her daughter could read something from the New Testament. They listened, astonished, as this second-generation native believer read to them from a Bible given by Schmidt 5 decades earlier. George Schmidt did not have to be present for the sapling he'd planted to grow into a pear tree. Nor did he need to be in South Africa for the gospel seed he'd sown to grow into a thriving church. God had been present, sustaining and growing the first shoots of life. And so I think it makes us wonder, what seeds have I sown in the lives of others? Are there people that I've talked to about Jesus who I haven't seen for a very, very long time? Well, the story continues. The next generation of Moravian missionaries continued George Schmidt's work, developing a self-sufficient, literate, agricultural community with a strong spiritual life. And within a decade, the governor of the region was so impressed with the impact of Baviaanskloof, the Valley of Bones, that he renamed it Genadendal, which means Valley of Grace. Phil Anderson writes in 1995, in recognition of its remarkable history, Nelson Mandela changed the name of the official residence of the President of South Africa from Westbrook to Genadendal. In making the announcement, he expressed a desire that the office of the President should also be under God's grace. In these times, perhaps more than any other in a very long time, we need God's grace. In these times, we need the hope of the gospel to be heard. Lord, I pray for you to make our area a valley of your grace.